Hello everyone and welcome to this course on modern application development. Okay, so far we have looked at a high level overview of JavaScript, right? And we now come to the most important part. Why did we bring JavaScript into the picture? We were talking about HTML to start with, and the reason why JavaScript comes into the picture is because we want to define custom elements. Okay, so what are custom elements? Now XML, as we saw earlier, allows arbitrary namespaces and tag definitions, right? But HTML5 does not use the same approach. Okay, what it does is that it has specific requirements for elements, okay, meaning that there are elements like title, h1 and so on, right? And HTML, or rather let me rephrase that, HTML5 has specific elements like title, h1, etc. But if I am allowed to define an arbitrary custom element, then should I really be allowed to say my button, and what is the browser supposed to infer from that? Just because the word button is there inside it, does it automatically infer that yes, this is a type of button? Or does it say, okay, this is a tag, I have no idea what it means? Okay, is it a heading? Is it a list item? Is it a button? Is it a link? Is it just a picture that's displayed on the screen? Nothing is clear from the name. Okay, as a human being, when I read the name my button, I think it must be a button, but there's no real need, there's nothing compulsory about that. Okay. On the other hand, there is another part to a tag element, which is to say how should a tag be shown. Okay, this is the part that JavaScript can actually solve best for you, right? It basically gives you display details. In other words, if you provide a tag, then how should that tag get displayed on the screen? Okay, now elements could also have states, right? I mean, in general, HTTP is a stateless protocol, but that doesn't mean that there are you can't have certain elements on the screen that have a state associated with them. A simple example is a checkbox, right? So on screen I might have a form where I have something to be checked off, right? Or a radio button or a checkbox. A checkbox or a radio button has state associated with it, right? Is it checked or is it not checked? Okay. Now if you are defining a new custom tag of your own, right, maybe it's something similar to a checkbox or maybe it is something else. The point is it might have some custom state of its own. How do I sort of keep track of that state? How do I use that state in a useful manner? That's also part of how you define an element, right? And finally, a question that we could ask is, should I restrict my customization to only taking built-in elements like headings or list items and adding functionality to them, or should I be able to build a completely new autonomous custom element, meaning that it has no relationship to any elements that are already defined, right? Or at least it's not directly related to any of them, right? And is completely standalone in some sense. Okay. Now the full details on how to use this is specified at this web page, right? We have this this particular web page is what I had referred to earlier. This is the HTML living standard. Okay, and within that living standard, what we are looking at over here is section 4.13, right, 4.13, which refers to custom elements, right? So this HTML living standard, you can see that it actually shows this was last updated on 30th September, right? I am recording this on the 1st of October, which literally means that this document was updated yesterday, right? On other days, it's not that it's updated every day, it might actually have been changed a few days back. And if you go look at this thing, you will find that yes, there are a number of updates, all the changes are recorded and tracked, right? So you can go back and find out what it looked like at a different point in time. But the ultimate thing is that whatever exists as of now is what you need to take as the living standard, so to say. Now one issue with this document is that in pretty much every section you will find this disclaimer, right, saying that this section is non-normative. Normative generally means it's actually part of a standard, right? And when you say non-normative, it means that it is potentially subject to change, right? Now they have to do that because part of the reason for being a living standard is that you can't really say that this is the standard, it's not going to change from now onwards. But it also means that you always have that concern that is this really what I should be following? Okay, anyway, the point is this is the standard that is followed today, and it's a good sort of document. It's also a somewhat dense document, not very easy to fully understand, but it's worth sort of at least skimming through to start with. It gives you a lot of useful information about how you can create an autonomous custom element, right? So for example, I could create something called a flag icon, right? A tag that does not exist in HTML. Now, what would this do? When I read it as a human being, I think, okay, most likely what is going to happen is I will take the country, I will find out what flag that should be there, get a picture of that flag and display it somewhere, right? But how does a browser really know what to do about it? That's where you basically have to go and declare everything in JavaScript, right? You have to say that there is a class flag icon which extends HTML element. It has certain attributes, it has callbacks, blah blah blah, and the most important thing is it also tells you how to update the rendering. That is to say, what should be displayed on the screen. In this particular case, it doesn't actually tell you what to do, right? So you can't use this piece of code, but you could sort of imagine that maybe I would need to go find one central location where the flags of all countries are there, find a picture corresponding to the flag of whichever country I need to display, and put that image on the screen. Okay. Once you have that piece of JavaScript, I can just call this custom elements.define. Okay, it's a function call. It's basically calling the custom elements API, the application programming interface, right? So the custom elements API, which is present inside any browser, right, that supports JavaScript, allows you to define saying that flag icon, right, this new tag will call this JavaScript function, or this class corresponds to this class flag icon. Okay, which means that from there onwards, after you have done all of this, you can then go there and directly have a piece of HTML in your code which shows flag icon country equal to NL/flag icon. Okay, so this document, in other words, gives you the basics of how that is supposed to be done, right? But it's not very easy to, it's not like a tutorial. You can't really read this and understand how to use it. So what people did is, rather than just sticking to the custom elements API which is present over there within JavaScript, they said, okay, let's try and make this a bit more useful, add some more components to it, right? And they came up with something called a web component definition, right? So a web component is something which makes use of three aspects of HTML essentially, right? One is the use of custom elements, which we already saw how you can define as part of the HTML5 and JavaScript APIs, right? It's basically a JavaScript API that allows you to create custom element tags. But on top of that, let's add some more thing to make it easier to use, because, right, if I'm adding a new tag, I probably want to display something on the screen, and it means that I should be able to control which parts of the screen are going to change. I don't want a style change that I make over here to suddenly go and affect the entire page. I would like to be able to affect just the part that I am interested in. Okay, that is done by using another API called the shadow document object model, right? And essentially what it does, right, at a high enough level, you can think about it, it allows you to keep the styling of the component that you are defining separate from the rest of the page, right? It's sort of an encapsulation, right? And finally, there is this concept called HTML templates, right? Template and slot were two new tags that were introduced in HTML5 that allow you to basically do something at a high enough level. You can think of it like Jinja templates. It's not exactly the same thing, but in principle, it's just allowing you to replace some text with something else. Okay, it doesn't have like the kind of templating language that Jinja has, but you can do it in other ways, because after all, you have access to JavaScript over here. Okay, so the template tag basically allows you to say that, okay, this is roughly what a template for displaying something should look like. Use that in order to actually display certain things. Okay. Now, probably the best way to explain this is once again through examples, and csstricks.com website actually has a couple of good examples that I'm just going to walk through over here. Right. So this web page, an introduction to web components, has some nice examples that you can look at, right, and in fact even play around with. Okay. So the first example that we have over here, right, and what we can do, the nice thing is you can actually open it on this website called CodePen, right, And code pen essentially allows you to have something like this, which is basically a snippet of HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and it displays the final output for you down here. Okay. So let's look at our HTML. It just has one line, which is just basically the new component that you have defined, right? You have got this thing called my component, and it shows you what that is. Now what is my component? I have this line at the bottom down here saying custom elements dot in the JavaScript side of things. I have this thing saying custom elements dot define my dash component, and it will call the class my component with capital M and capital C. And what does my component itself do? It just basically adds the text, or rather it says this dot inner HTML is equal to the text hello world. Okay. Now let's try playing around with it a little bit. I'm going to add some text over here, right? I'm going to try some more text, right? And it automatically goes in and displays whatever is there in the text, right? So what you can see is that it has basically taken the inner HTML of the page that you have, wherever you had this my component, right, and replaced it with the text hello world. Okay, which means that now what you get corresponding to the my component is this hello world that is present out here. Okay, and then after that you have basically added on this some more text. Okay, now what happens if I right? So what you can see is I have some text before that, I have my component over here, and I have some more text, right? I can also go further and make another copy of that, right? So I will just basically make 2 more copies of this my component, right? And as you can see, it renders again down here and it basically shows it 3 times. Okay. So what did this do? This was just basically a very simple example of the most basic element, basic part of a web component, right? The fact that you can create a custom element. Okay. It goes further and says how you can use the shadow DOM, right? Now the shadow DOM is a little bit more tricky to explain. What it says over here, and in fact the example that you have, right, sort of shows that there is some text out here, right, with a div, right, in the HTML part, which basically says this will use the CSS background, and then there is a button that says not tomato, okay, which you can see down here, right. Now what does the JavaScript itself do? If you look at the HTML text, right, what it said was, I mean, if you think about it, what it should have displayed was this will use the CSS background, that's all, okay. But what the JavaScript does is, it basically goes and modifies that slightly, adds background tomato as the style, it also adds the text tomato, right, and it basically converts this entire thing that you had out here into a button. Okay. So in other words, what it has done is, it has managed to add some extra styling and also convert the whatever you had out here, right, into a button, right, without affecting the rest of the page itself, right. In other words, this shadow root that we created out here using these commands restricted itself only to this part. So this style that we created, right, even though we gave the background tomato, that button background did not go and modify this button, right. So the not tomato remains as it is. The fact that I went and modified the button background class, right, the button background style over here to tomato, applies only to the first button, not to the second one. Okay, a little bit tricky to understand, but it's worth understanding how it works if you are planning to get into this in more detail at least. And finally, there is this notion of HTML templates, right. So what does an HTML template do? The example that they have given over here basically shows you that you might have information where, let's say, you have a piece of JavaScript which contains a list, right, of books, and each book basically has a title and an author. Okay. Now the question becomes, how are you going to display it, right? And what is being done over here is, there are like templates that are created out here, and in fact the demonstration can be shown right now. The way that it is showing it right now is basically it shows the title of the page, puts a dash and shows the author of the page. Okay. And now by just clicking on this one radio button that says template 2, it changes around and says F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic novel The Great Gatsby, Ernest Hemingway's classic novel A Farewell to Arms, and so on, right? In other words, it's changed the template. The template now became title of the book space classic novel, or rather the author's name space classic novel space the title of the novel. Okay. So just by making a change in the template, you were able to modify the way that this got displayed. Ultimately, what happens as a result is that you can have more and more complicated such web components that are built up, and start composing an entire web page out of such components, right? So once again, the Mozilla Developer Network, right, they have this GitHub page that contains a number of different examples. Okay. So this, in fact, this MDN, the github.com/MDN, they contain a number of web components examples, right, which you can also see live. Okay, you can actually see what it looks like. Okay. So in fact, some of them are quite instructive and useful to sort of see how they work, right. So let's just dive into one of them, which is a very simple example, right. What it says is the JavaScript corresponding to this, it looks a little bit long, but it's quite small compared to most of the other JavaScript, right. It's worth just understanding what it does. It's now defining a new class which extends the HTML paragraph element. Okay, so interesting. What it's doing is it's sort of creating an extension on top of an element that already exists. It's not defining a new element by itself. All this part about the constructor and so on is just like the initialization, the init function that you call in Python, right. The important part is it creates a shadow root, and it's trying to create the text corresponding to that root. Okay, and what is the text? It's going to be equal to some variable called count. Okay, and what is this variable count? It is going to be by running this function count words, right, which is defined out here. Okay, so what does count words do? It basically takes the node.innerText, right, splits it on white space, and basically takes the length of that. In other words, it splits on one or more spaces, gets all the non-space characters grouped together, right, and counts how many such groupings were there. Okay, a very trivial way of counting words, but effective, right. So this function count words has been defined in order to count the number of words in a given piece of text, in fact specifically in the inner text corresponding to a given node, which means that I can then call count words on the parent of this node, right, which I get again from the JavaScript over here, set that as the text of something that I want to display, and also set it so that every 200 milliseconds I will update this word count. Okay, and finally I define a custom element, right. The word count is defined as calling this class capital word count, and it extends p, right. It was defined as an extension of HTML paragraph element, and here we say that it extends p, that is to say the p element type. What does the index.html look like? It's like fairly regular HTML up to this point, right. It just declares a content editable article. You can ignore that for now. It basically means it's sort of like a text area that you can type text into. It has some random text generated in there, and this line 17 that you see over here basically says there is a word count paragraph, right. In other words, it's a p, an element of type p paragraph, but with the extension word count applied to it. Okay, what does this look like when you actually go to a page like that, right? It basically says word count rating widget, and when I click somewhere there, I find that I can actually edit it. Now look at this number down here saying words colon 212, right. Let me go and start typing something more here, right? And you can see that as I type, it starts changing this number of words. It has become 216, right? And I can actually go in there and perhaps add some more text, right? All of this works, but you will realize that you can't actually select this words colon 220 and delete it. It's not part of the paragraph. It just sits over there because it was created by the JavaScript. It's not something you typed in. Okay, so no matter where else you type, it will automatically add this at the end. So is this useful? Think about it. Let's say that you are creating an editor for somebody to fill in a form. You create one standard widget like this, which basically takes an HTML area where you can type text and puts a word count at the bottom, right? It need not just be a word count, it might even be something which if you go beyond a certain value will actually raise an alert and stop you from typing, right? Or you could have something which basically puts a timer out there, and after you have typed for a certain amount of time, it counts down and says, okay, stop, right? All that functionality could have been added in just by modifying that main.js, which defines the web component. Now, where this becomes really useful is, think about how the web component was defined. It was just done in this main.js, which basically had this class word count, which extended paragraph element, okay? It did not have any relationship to this particular website. It did not have any other dependencies on what is being done over here, which means that I could have taken it, put it on my website, you could have taken it, put it on your website. Somebody could have installed it on GitHub or some other place, and I could have just referenced it from there and it would work, okay, which means it becomes reusable. And that is sort of the key behind web components, okay, the fact that you are creating reusable user interface components, okay. So to summarize, what is the point of web components? It basically is an API that can allow you to extend HTML5 element or tag capabilities, right? It uses something extra called the shadow DOM, which restricts the scope of styling and allows you to create self-contained encapsulated units, and it uses templates that allows you to write reusable code, okay. You combine all these three together and you have this definition of something called web components, right? And the primary goal of this is reuse of widgets. Well, widget is just a generic term for something that you might want to use in different parts of your screen, of your user interface. So one of the biggest problems, of course, with this entire approach is this, unfortunately, right, the web component part is not standardized. And if you think about it, you can understand why, because the API is standardized how to create a new custom element, but how should I use a shadow DOM, how should I use templates and so on is largely a matter of subjective interpretation, okay. So there's a very good chance that people might object and say, look, that's not the way I think about it, that's not how I want to do it, okay.